Hi, I'm Stu Bamick, and I've spent most of my life trying to understand all of life from God's perspective. Today, I want to talk about God's perspective on relationships, on how to build healthy, growing, thriving relationships between each other and between our God. Because I've learned over time that when relationships aren't going so well, life doesn't go so well. And when relationships do go well, life goes well. I remember talking to an elderly woman that I used to take home communions to once a month. She was very, very, very wealthy. She had house people to help her get around as she was older and basically bedridden. And finally, she ended up in the hospital. I'd never met any of her children. And in the hospital, shortly before she died, she said these words to me. She said, "I hate them." I said, "What do you mean you hate them?" She said, "I hate my children. I hate what they've done to me. We're estranged. They've left me here dying alone. I have everything that a person could possibly want in life, but I'm here alone, dying without them. I hate them." And I thought, oh man, how important and how valuable relationships are to us. Because when relationships don't work so well, life doesn't work so well. And that's why today I want to talk about how to grow healthy, thriving, vital, intimate, safe relationships. And to do that, I want to look at the 5 biblical building blocks of relationships. Now, in this series of messages on how to become an overcomer, we've been looking at the life of David. We looked at the 5 fundamental gifts or characteristics of his life, from his highs and his lows to the essence of fear, to how to overcome fear as he climbed down into the darkness of the valley and fought that great giant Goliath, which represented the fears of the people in the nation of Israel and of the warriors and of Saul himself. Today, I want to look at the story of David and Jonathan and what goes into building healthy, vital, thriving relationships. And I want to do that by looking at the 5 Hebrew verbs that are in this story. So we're going to look at some Hebrew words today. The biblical Hebrew is a dead language. It's not spoken anymore. The language of the Hebrews in Israel is not the Hebrew of the Old Testament. It's a modern day language. It's not the old ancient dead language. So I want to look at these 5 old Hebrew words that define the very essence and the relationship of what love is really all about. And we're going to do that by starting with the first verb that defines what love really is. Now, the first Hebrew verb for the word of building great relationships is the word achav, A-H-A-B. Achav. The H is pronounced with a C-H in the old ancient language of the Hebrews. It's a friendship, it's a love, it's devotion, companionship towards one another. We read these words in 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 1. We read these words: "As soon as David had finished speaking to Saul the king, the soul of Jonathan became one to the soul of David. And Jonathan loved him," Achav, he loved him as his own soul. They were knit together in spirit, tied together. They loved each other as they loved each other's souls. And Jonathan didn't love David just for his great military victories or that his great courage in battle, that he was a great warrior. But they were aware that they had this unwavering heart towards God together. It was a commonness about them, that they loved God. And this feeling of love was not just to the Hebrew a feeling, but it always was an action attached to the feeling. You can't see love. You can only see it by its actions, by what it does. And so love is not just about getting, it's about giving. It's not only receiving, it is about caring for someone. It's about sacrificial love, being willing to give your life for someone else. And it is this kind of love that we're going to see in this relationship between Jonathan and between David. It's the kind of love that God has for you and me. John 3:16 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, Who did what? God, the Creator God, loved the cosmos. That's you and me, the world, the cosmos. So much, how much? That he did something. He gave something. What did he give? The highest gift that he had to give. He gave his monogenes, his only son. To the Hebrew, to God, love is an action. It is a giving. Now, what's interesting about the story of David and Jonathan is that if anyone had reason to be angry with David or be afraid of David or want to eliminate David or be threatened by David, it would have been Jonathan. He was the heir to the throne of Saul. He was Saul's son. But he knew that one day David would have his kingdom, his crown, and his throne. But rather than hate David, he loved him as his own soul because Jonathan loved God. He loved him. He was willing to give his life for him. He had a chav for him. Now, the second Hebrew verb that I want you to understand, there's a chav, which is this love, a giving kind of action, love. The second word I want you to understand is the word berith that we find in this passage, B-E-R-I-T-H, berith. It is a covenant. It is a promise. It is a commitment at the highest level. We read in 1 Samuel now chapter 20, verse 8, we read these words. Therefore, this is David speaking, deal kindly with your servant, David, speaking to Jonathan. Deal kindly with me, for you have brought your servant into a covenant, a berith of the Lord with you. A berith, a sacred covenant. David is saying, I want our relationship to go to the next level. I want to formalize this relationship by means of a promise or a contract or a commitment, a covenant, a vow. When I marry couples, and I just recently did a marriage, and they're all filled with the Novocaine of romance and all googly-eyed, and we get to that part in the service with the vows where we say, I commit myself to you for rich or for poorer, for better, for worse, in sickness and in health. And I can understand or see how they're translating that during the service. It's, I love you for richer and better and healthier. But we know that marriage has with it that component of poorer and harder and worse and sick. And sometimes things get really, really tough. And that's why built into love, a kav, is the concept of covenant keeping, of promise keeping, of saying there is something that you can trust. This is a safe relationship, that love is a relationship between two parties that come together and make these commitments. And when you love someone, the more you love them, the more power you give over to them to either help you or to hurt you. And so there must be this built-in promise keeping here, that I will do more than just love you. I will protect you. I will make a promise to you in a relationship so that no one has an unfair advantage over the other. I love the words of Lewis Smead at Fuller Seminary in Pasadena, California. He writes, the secret to growing together is promise keeping. The secret to growing together is promise keeping. What a wonderful thing a promise is. When people make promises, they are reaching out into an unpredictable future, and that makes one thing predictable, that they will be there for one another, even when being there will cost them more than they want to pay. With one promise, a person can create an island of certainty in a sea of uncertainty. Somewhere there must be people who make and keep their promises. They won't quit when the going gets rough because they promised to see it through. They stick to lost causes. They hold on to love grown cold. If you have a ship, you will not desert it. If you have a person, you will not forsake them. If you have a cause, you will not abandon it. And only then are you becoming like the heart of God. You see, what he's saying here is that relationships are promise keeping. It's making promises and keeping promises. It's making promises for the times when life gets hard. It's saying, I assure you, I will see this through. I will be with you. I will always be with you. I'm committed. I'm committed. I'm committed. No matter what. This is what David and Jonathan are committing to each other. We're committed to each other no matter what happens. We will protect and guard this relationship. They move from affection, feelings of love, the chav, to commitment, to covenant making. Now, once we have the love and once we have the commitment, the promise keeping, we move to a third level of relationship, of building healthy relationships. And this is the Hebrew word chesed, C-H-E-S-E-D-H. It means a steadfast love, a trusting, a loyalty. We read further in the story, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 15 and 16. And do not cut off your steadfast love from my house forever, when the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth. And Jonathan made a covenant. Again, we see that word berith, covenant, with David. Do not cut off your steadfast love from my house. Chesed. This is a hard word to translate. There's no English equivalent to it. It's a steadfast love. It's a loyalty. It is when relationship moves to trust, to a deep, abiding trust. It moves from love to a promise to trust. Love, promise, and trust. Relational experts talk to us about three circles of relationship, and I like to look at this when we're talking about the concept of chesed, of steadfast love, of loyalty, of trust. First, there's this outer circle. These are lots of people that are loosely related, people in the marketplace, in the neighborhood, people you might golf with, have occasional interactions with. These are low-level commitments. They take very little investment on our part from our emotions in terms of the giving. That's the outer circle. Then there's a middle circle. These relationships, they move from just low-level interaction to spending time together. You take vacations together. You look out after each other's kids. There's a shared affinity. You enjoy being together. It might be what happens when our kids were growing up. They were involved in hockey, and you spend so much time together in each level and each progression of stages of the game that I remember one woman telling me one day that the hockey team was her church, that people on the hockey team more knew about her and who was sick and where her kids were and what was happening than any other circle in the world. This is the middle circle of its higher level relationships. But there is a third level that goes higher than that. That's the inner circle of relationships. Now, these relationships are rare. They are priceless. We only get a few in our lifetime. They are people who touch our hearts. They know your story. They're careful with your feelings. You can count on these people. They're the safe people. And we only get 5 or 8 of them, maybe 10 in a lifetime. We only get so many. So be careful with them. They're built on love and on commitment and on trust, on chesed, on steadfast love and loyalty to each other. Now, isn't it interesting that we live in a world today that is at an all-time trust level low? An all-time low. We live in a trust-lacking culture, a trust-lost culture. No one trusts anyone else. And we know from relationships that when you lose trust, you lose everything. You lose the relationship. And this is what happens. And then people get polarized. And not only do they get dogmatic in their polarization, but they also get angry if you don't agree with that polarization or that dogma which they have created as an inward truth. Then we lose trust in each other. This is what I love about the Bible. What I love about the Bible is that when we get lost, it resets the standard. And I'm convinced that it's only when we return back to the values and the teachings of the Bible itself that our culture can right itself. That the Bible matters, that God matters, that there is truth, there is a way out of this, there is a way that God has designed for what good relationships are supposed to look like. And that design is for love to turn into promise and covenant and commitment, and that promise and commitment is to turn into trustfulness with each other. So when we break that trust and lose that trust, which we do, and we get into areas where there's betrayal and there's brokenness and there's envy and there's hurt and there's confusion and there's darkness, what then? Well, I have the great opportunity to declare to you this morning that the Bible, or today, or in this moment, that the Bible makes a provision for when we get lost in relationship and lose that love and that promise and that trust. Well, what happens when we break our love and our commitment and our trust? God makes this amazing provision. It's called grace. In the Hebrew, chen, C-H-E-N, charis in the Greek. It's undeserved, unmerited favor for you and me. It's when we break the covenant and lose the trust that God provides for us. In the garden with Adam and Eve, the ultimate issue there was their lack of trust in God, and they sinned and they took that one apple. You know, it's symbolic of fallenness, that God gives us everything we could possibly need in the garden, everything possible, but it's never enough. And they want more, and they break that trust, and they hide from God, and they're cast out of the garden, cast out with the cherubim, with the flaming swords to protect them from coming back into the garden, where there's, interestingly, the second tree, the tree of life, the tree of eternal life, which God had not allowed them to eat yet. And he wanted to see what they were going to do. And when they failed and they lacked trust, God cast them out of the garden and didn't permit them to eat of this tree of life. But he promises them that one day he will provide grace for them. He does something he doesn't have to do for them and for us, for all of humanity. He provides amazing grace, undeserved grace. He extends unmerited favor upon his people. Through God's Son, Jesus Christ, he enters back into the garden. He ushers us back into the garden so that we can eat of the tree of eternal life and live with him in the presence and the fellowship of God through the power of the Holy Spirit forever. Our God promises to those that turn back to him to receive his grace, he promises that when you are faithless, I will be faithful. This is the wonder of his unfailing, amazing love and grace. So in a couple messages, when we look at the life of David and Nathan, and Nathan confronts David for his sinfulness. Remember, we talked about how David was famous for his sinfulness and his relationship with this beautiful woman. When we get there, David confesses his guilt. This is an amazing passage. I don't want you to miss this message. Very, very powerful message of restoration of our hearts and our souls and our minds. David says, have mercy on me, O God, according to thy steadfast love, thy chesed. It's right here. Right there in that passage. Have mercy on me according to thy chesed, according to thy steadfast love, thy loyalty built on promise, built on love. David prays the prayer and uses the words that he's using here between himself and Jonathan, the unfailing love that leads to grace. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy steadfast love, according to thy abundant mercy, thy grace. Cleanse me from my iniquity and wash me from my sin. And God has this provision for us in relationship with him and in relationship with each other. Now, I'm not talking about bad, codependent kind of relationships here. I'm talking about the kind of relationships that God designed when somebody fails, not in a steady habitual pattern, but when there's failure in that relationship, that the response is to be grace. It's the fourth level of relationship. But that fourth level leads to the highest form of relationship, the fifth Hebrew verb. The last level of relationship, of vital, thriving, personal relationship, is the word shalom, S-H-A-L-O-M, peace. We find these words in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 42. Then Jonathan said to David, after they've made this love and these promises and this loyalty, and they received grace with each other, Jonathan said to David, go in peace. Because we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you. God's between us. This is God's thing here. This is God's relationship. He made us to thrive on relationship and built us to have relationship. And between my offspring, my descendants, and your offspring, forever. And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. Go in peace, Jonathan said to David. There is love, and there is covenant, and there is trust, and there is grace, and that leads to peace, a sense of inner tranquility and goodness, that all is right with the world. Things are the way they should be. This is the final essence of relationship, that there is a peace about relationship. And then David flees south into the desert. Jonathan retraces his steps back to the palace in Jerusalem. They are never ever again to see each other. They live out their own destinies with this sworn friendship between them and between their descendants. What a touching scene to see them part their ways. But listen to what happens in 2 Samuel chapter 9, verse 7. David said to him, to who? Well, you'll see in just a moment. Do not fear, for I will show you kindness, chesed, steadfast love, for the sake of your father Jonathan, and I will restore you to all the land of Saul your father, and you shall eat at my table always, forever. There is chesed, loyalty, trust, covenant, promise-keeping, love. And they had made a promise to watch out for each other's children and their children's children. Remember my families, no matter what you do. Now, listen to this. Years later, Jonathan dies in battle. And in the midst of the battle, he has his 5-year-old son is being carried by his nurse, fleeing the city, and she trips going down some stairs and drops the child and paralyzes him below the waist. Forever. He's a cripple, a lifelong cripple. Well, years and years and years pass by, and David is the king of Israel. It's the golden age of Israel. And he's at his table one evening, and he says, are there any descendants left of Jonathan? Now, servants are afraid to say anything because they know the custom is to kill the servants or the descendants of previous kings, so they won't endanger or threaten the kingdom or the crown or the throne. And David keeps asking, is there anyone left? And they said, well, we'll get into the story later, the story of Mephibosheth. There is one. He's a cripple. He's of no harm to you, so let him go. Don't worry about him. But David says, no, you go find him and bring him to me. Bring him here to me. When they bring him, he asks him, what is your name? And he says, Mephibosheth. You know who I am. David says, Mephibosheth, you know who I am, Mephibosheth says, and he's afraid for his life. He's crippled. He's been paralyzed, hiding out all of his life in fear. David says, bring him here. Set him down at my table. He will eat at my table the rest of his life, of my food, and be treated like a king. And I will restore to him all that he had lost of his father Jonathan and his grandfather Saul. He will eat at my table. He will eat at my table. This is what happens when we have communion. Come eat at my table. That one day we will sit and eat at the table of a king in heaven forever. Everything we could possibly want. And when we do that, there's a sense of security that all is well and that we are at peace. We are where we belong, where we were fit. We end up where we were designed to be, at the table of God, living in fellowship with Him forever. And these are the building blocks of relationship with God, of love, of commitment, of trust, of grace, and of peace. And these are the building blocks of healthy, thriving, growing, dynamic, great relationships between you and me. That there is that love, and it's an action, and it turns into a covenant, a commitment. There is promise-keeping involved, and that promise-keeping turns into a steadfast love, a trust, a loyalty. And then when there's failure or brokenness, there is grace given and grace received. And when that grace is given and received, there is a peace about life and about relationship that God extends to us and that we are to extend to each other. These are the 5 healthy building blocks of how to have a great relationship. Now, in this next message, I want you to see what happens when relationships really break down and how we overcome failure in our lives.